Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Good morning. I am delighted to have Dwight Weingarten with me, as well as some of our proud MDDC interns, to talk about, this is part of our masterclass series that MDDC is doing this summer, to talk to the reporters whose work has won a Best of Show at the MDDC contest. And so this is a pretty big deal. So first, welcome Dwight Weingarten, who is an investigative reporter for both the Daily Times and the Herald-Mail. So it'll be interesting to see how you juxtapose those two pieces. And he also covers the Maryland State House and state issues as part of the USA Today network. So welcome, Dwight.
Well, good morning, Rebecca. Thank you so much for having me.
So first, actually, I wanted to share or put into context the article that we're here to talk about. So this series is really kind of jumping behind the scenes to understand from you how this piece came together, what the impact was, kind of how it all worked. And for Natalie and Tiara, who are joining us today, jump in, ask questions. This is a great opportunity to learn from a seasoned reporter. But in terms of context, MDDC has a contest every year where we highlight the best journalism of our members. It's split into, I think, 86 categories. And within those categories, each member belongs to a certain division. So you're kind of competing against similar publications. All the first place winners from each division then go head to head and battle it out for Best of Show. So investigative reporting is one of our more popular categories. And so Dwight, you won Best of Show for your article that looked at child labor in Purdue plants. So this was with your Daily Times hat on. Tell us a little bit about that article and sort of what precipitated the investigation.
Well, I would say the best journalism is a team effort. And I got a recommendation to look into this from an editor at the Daily Times who sent me a New York Times article on child labor, specifically on the eastern shore of Virginia. And given that Purdue is based in Salisbury, which is where the Daily Times is based, I wanted to pursue that article. And the first thing that I did was I went back to some previous reporting that I had done on child labor allegations in fast food establishments. And based off of that reporting, I had a contact with the United States Department of Labor and was able to, that day that I read the article, just send a message to that person and find out what was going on with Purdue and with some of the allegations that had been written about in the New York Times article. And so the first step really was just to confirm what I had read in that article. And so that was the impetus for pursuing the story. It was to get some questions answered that a national publication had written, but there were still some things that I thought needed a little bit more investigation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And so just again, to kind of put into context, I mean, children can work. I know you were talking, your sort of lead source was 14 at the time that he was injured. Mm-hmm. And so what for those of us who maybe have left our teen years behind, how much can children work, and what are the parameters, and what were you finding here in this investigation?
Well, again, based off of the reporting that I had done with regards to child labor in the fast food industry, I had found that there were laws that prevented children from working certain hours, and in specifically in certain high risk fields. And one of those high risk fields was of cleaning, um, agricultural and meat processing, um, uh, you know, meat processing equipment. And so um, I had to, again, familiarize myself with some of those regulations. And what I found in my initial contact with the United States Department of Labor was that an investigation was opened up against both Purdue, which is based out of Salisbury, and Tyson Foods, which I believe is based out of Arkansas.
Mhm. So then, when as you're trying to build this kind of story, like you first sounds like fact check. Okay, is there a story here? Is there
Mhm.
something going
Mhm.
on? Then how do you approach it?
Well, great question. What I did after reading the New York Times article, uh, and that was a great article. I believe the author won a Pulitzer Prize for that series. But there were questions at the local level, specifically of what had happened on Virginia's Eastern Shore that were not answered. And so I reached out to both Purdue and Tyson for requests for comments and with several questions. And I also reached out to the subcontractor who was uh, cited in the New York Times article, but only briefly. This was the subcontractor who was cleaning the Purdue facility and had allegedly hired the individual, the teenager who was hurt. And so I reached out to all three of those companies and got varying levels of responses back from those companies. And so when those responses were coming in, and some of the companies were more forthcoming than others,
Mhm.
um, I then had to really analyze, well, what do I have here? Um, and as I laid it out and thought about what each of those three entities said or did not say, um, I realized that they couldn't all necessarily be, um, things still didn't line up. I'll put it like that. And so, given that this was a deadline article and I only had, I would say, less than 24 hours from the time I got the initial um, tip about it to when I had to file the article, um, I knew that there were some questions that I still wouldn't be able to answer prior to filing that article. But I thought in laying it out for the reader, what I had found and what these companies had said, that would be useful for the reader, and it could potentially move the story forward. And so that's what I did, was I laid out some of these responses in the article. And as I said, fortunately, I had done some background reporting on this topic and was able to include some statistics about child labor, um, generally in the country, and then also what to do if child labor is found out. And I included the Department of Labor's contact information, uh, again, with the aim of hopefully protecting children from being in a circumstance like this in the future and preventing these instances from happening.
So, what was the upshot, when you published this, and it sounds like, you took the initial tip, went deeper into
Mm-hmm.
um, your local world on that under deadline pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But what was the result of the article? Did you go deeper at some point? Did you follow up? Was there, did or inquiries into child labor laws increase? What happened?
Well, uh, so I laid it out. I laid it out there, and one thing that I do just as a pattern of practice for all my articles, in the interest of fairness, um, if I quote someone in the article, whether that be a company or a company's CEO or anyone, I always follow up with that person or company and just send them the article so that they're aware of it and so that there's a level of transparency. I've found that's a good practice. And I don't recall receiving an immediate response from all the different entities on this piece, but um, as I put in the article, there was a Department of Labor investigation, and I later learned that that investigation concluded that there was a consent order and a settlement with one of these companies, and that there would be fines assessed for uh, for those actions. And so I did do a follow-up article uh, actually this year about what the outcome of that investigation was from the federal level. And in doing so, I also reached out again to all of those entities and, gave them an opportunity to comment so that the full story could be told and that it wouldn't be a story that started to open up something but didn't finish it.
Hmm. So, and just, I'm curious, how pervasive is this problem? It just seems so counterintuitive to hire children when there are such strict regulations against what they can do and the age factor. Not to mention, it just seems like such bad PR. So, like, how pervasive was this problem?
Well, I'm looking at the article now, and these statistics are a little bit dated, but uh, there was about a doubling from 2017 to 2022 in terms of the number of minors employed in violation of child labor laws, and that number in 2022 had grown to just under 4,000 children involved um, in violation of child labor laws, including about 700 minors involved in hazardous occupations, which would have been the case for um, the individual, on the eastern shore of Virginia. And uh, again, that's nearly 700 too many.
Hmm.
But again, to keep in mind that this is a nationwide figure from the U.S. Department of Labor.
Okay. Were you able to talk to the individual who was the child who was hurt, at all, or?
That brings to a very important part of the article, which is both companies that would have been involved in this case potentially um, did not say that this 14-year-old or 13-year-old had ever been employed from uh, their company. And so what you had was the New York Times reporting that said that this young man was involved at this facility, but you had both the subcontractor and the company saying we have no record of this individual. So to answer your question, I was never able to locate the young man, and basically what I had was the federal Department of Labor investigation that said that this had been uh, looked into, and that, again, in the most recent follow-up article, that was something that was part of the settlement, was just noting that this allegation um, was included in that settlement.
Hmm. So it's like this phantom, this boy was hurt, but he wasn't working. He wasn't tied to anyone. And I'm just actually I'm curious when you're working investigative, because you do a ton of investigative reporting, because that's your
Mm-hmm.
job, um,
Mm-hmm.
and you're doing these types of follow-ups. How do you keep a source maybe talking to you or on your side? Because obviously you're investing. There's sensitive things that
Very much so.
you're investigating. So what's your strategy, and how do you kind of keep a source talking to you as you're doing these follow-ups and as you're asking really hard questions that they really don't want to answer?
Well, first I'll start with what I mentioned earlier, which is a level of transparency. I mentioned that I sent the article to the individuals and companies when it published, and I think that helps bring a level of credibility, that
Mm,
what you see from me is what you're going to get. And um, I would also say to keep in mind the larger issue, which child labor generally in the country. And so while I was trying my very best to get at the what happened in this specific incident, I realized when I got to the point where I had asked the questions that I had asked, and the answers came, and there it was clear that not everything lined up.
mhm,
That what I could do was show that to the readers, show that it doesn't line up just by putting those statements um, in an intelligent way so that it would be clear, but then also bring that larger issue into it, and not lose sight of the fact that whatever is the outcome of this specific case, um, which is horrendous to have a teenager hurt. What you can do is bring it to the larger issue with the hopes that that work goes forward, and it addresses and makes um, a positive influence on the situation going forward. And so that's what I tried to do with this article.
mhm. Yeah. And Natalie and Tara, if you have questions, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I have lots of things up my sleeve because I also wanted to know, Dwight, you have, I think, a real juxtaposition because you're doing investigative work not only on the Eastern Shore for the Daily Times, but also for the sister publication, the Herald-Mail in Hagerstown. And of course, they're both kind of rural community, like rural-esque communities.
Yes.
Um, but that's probably where, the most in common things that they have. How do you balance doing that type of investigatory work in those two disparate locations?
Well, again, I'll go back to what I said at the top, which is the best journalism, I feel, is a team effort. And,
Mhm.
this article wasn't the outcome of my work alone. I tip my hat to the editor who sent me the article um, soon after it was published from the New York Times. And, then again, um, to read the news, read the local um, uh, articles that are in the various publications. I learn a lot from my colleagues and the work that they do. Um, and so, as far as the balance, it's important to know what's going on in the local communities, but it's also important to know what's going on in the country.
Mhm.
The New York Times, the Washington Post, those publications can provide ideas that you think, well, how is this playing out in Salisbury? How is this playing out in Hagerstown? And that coupled with um, you know, being on site and talking to people, different things will come to light. And also, I would say what's happened in the past is people have read some of my work
Mhm.
and they will write me an email or contact me and say, well, you should look into this too. And
Mhm.
not all of those lead to an article, um, but some do. And it gives you an idea of what's going on within the local communities.
Sure. So it sounds like being present and being sort of very visible in that community, sort of accepting the tips that come in your way and
Mhm.
being interested in what's happening and like
Yes.
connecting it to the wider issues of the day is pretty important.
Yes. Yes, most definitely.
Now, how did you get involved in investigative reporting? Were you always an investigative reporter, or is this a new beat?
Well, I haven't always been an investigative reporter, but it is part of what I went to journalism school for.
Hmm.
My specialization in journalism school was, and it's kind of a long title, but it was social justice and investigative reporting. And
Okay.
so it was training that I had received while I was in school that helped me kind of own this beat. And as you mentioned, Rebecca, that beat has gone statewide and um, involves a lot of different things. But I did receive, I would say, very good training in some of the investigative practices that I use today.
Hmm. Oh, Natalie, what would you like to bring up?
Hi, I just wanted to jump in because I'm kind of like interested in investigative reporting myself.
Mhm.
And I know you said like you got a lot of training for it. Like, what were
Mhm.
some of the key takeaways that you got, or what really helped you when you first started out?
Great question. I think the fact checking element, uh, and I mentioned that at the top of what I did, even though the article had been published in the New York Times, the first thing that I did was confirm uh, several points of fact with a source that I had. And, you know, you know, investigative reporting, I would say, is um, builds on how you can confirm and stack up those facts and lay them out in a way that uncovers something that uh, you know digs out something that can be shared to the general public. And I think that has come over years in terms of where to look and what to look for and how to build those facts and lay them out in an article. But as far as when I first started out, I think you just you stay with the basics of the craft, which is to confirm and to fact check, and then uh, that builds on itself over a career, and you develop more sources, and you develop different places to look based off of articles that you've written in the past.
Mhm. So, thank you for that, Natalie. That was really helpful to understand, what's important about becoming an investigative journalist. And one thing that I'd love to know is what's different about investigative reporting versus just covering a standard beat. What are there different I feel like the skills are the same in some ways, but could you kind of articulate what you see as the difference? And then we'll get to Tiara, who has a question.
Great question, Rebecca. And by no means do I want to say that, you know, every reporter should be checking, should be
Oh, yeah.
confirming different things, whether you're writing a article about, um, you know, the baseball game in town, or you're writing about government issues, or what have you. The skills are the same. I would say, in my experience, the investigative work sometimes takes a little bit longer, and it takes a little bit more persistence to bring those things out. I know we're talking about one article that today, but I can think about some of the articles where I used Public Information Act requests
Hmm.
to uncover government information in the public interest and use that in my articles. And that isn't a tool necessarily you have when you're dealing with companies as much as when you're dealing with a government entity. But you know, Public Information Act requests really can be the basis for some good investigative reporting. Again, knowing that that's a tool, knowing that that is really a tool that has been earned by reporters over the decades to have that, and then to be able to utilize it again, not just so you can write a good article, but you're doing something in the public interest, and
Hmm.
you know, to again, better society by the reporting.
Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. And, making as a beat reporter, you kind of are leaning on sources, which you do in investigative work, but I think also in the investigative side, you can't always depend on your sources to really tell you all the pieces. You need sort of that backbone of public information to kind of gut check and suss out where those facts aren't lining up.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Makes perfect sense. Tiara, you had a question. What would you like to share?
Yes. When you were doing the child labor piece, what other children were affected, and what were their stories that stuck out to you the most?
That's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, I had done some previous reporting on uh, child labor in the fast food industry.
Mhm.
Um, and that caught my eye because you drive by fast food establishments every day, for the most part. And so I, I really, as I was doing the reporting, I was keeping that, you know, the children that were mentioned, the child that was mentioned, top of mind. And I would have liked to be able to let that voice speak for himself. In this case, I wasn't able to do that under the deadline, and also, you know, given where the reporting led. But uh, you asked what stood out the most. Just thinking about some of the services that we use frequently, and you want to. I'll speak for myself, but you want to live in a society where, um, you know, the services that you use every day are above board, meaning that, you know, when you're getting a hamburger, or you're getting, uh, you know, the things that we all rely on, you just you want there to be um, decency in all those things, and so to have um, a United States Department of Labor that's, you know, holding the line on that, and keeping you know, things in order, you know, that's a good thing. And you know, again, not having it get lost, you know, that the vast majority of businesses are doing things above board and are uh, complying and showing rigor in their adherence to the law. And so I don't want that to get lost. But it does stand out to me when you're seeing different instances of these things across the country, and they're in everyday establishments that I certainly go to. So, anyways, it hits home when you see those big names, and you just want there to be decency in the actions, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And I would think that investigative reporting really calls that out specifically, and nobody likes to frequent places where human misery is like fueling the product or service. So what other things are you working on now? Are you kind of following some child labor work, or what's interesting, what's striking your interest now?
Well, a lot of different things. I would also say that I mentioned to you prior to starting the call, Rebecca, that I cover the Maryland General Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an article that published last year. It was about the state prison population, and specifically where individuals return upon reentry. And that was an article, again, published last year, where I used a Public Information Act request to get some of that information. And that led to, I think it is fair to say, because I was in correspondence with the bill sponsor, that led to a law that passed one of the chambers. And again, you have the House of Delegates and the Maryland State Senate, but it didn't, because of the overwhelming number of pieces of legislation, it didn't pass this year. And so that's something that I'm looking into, as the General Assembly will come back next year, to see if, what started as an article could turn into something that becomes law for the state, just in terms of having that information be public and be reported to the various state agencies. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
That's so exciting to see, your investigation, your thoughts kind of like making real tangible change in the state. Now, where do returning citizens usually go? Like, and that's probably really important for Hagerstown because one of the facilities is right out there.
Yes. Well, and again, as I said earlier, journalism being a team effort, there had been some legislators in Hagerstown, because they have 3 state prisons in that area, to find out, where these returning citizens go to. And I don't have those numbers I don't have those statistics in front of me, but the vast majority are returning to the more populous counties in the state. But that was a statewide story, because there are prisons both in the western part of the state and also on the eastern shore. And again, based off of my reporting and driving very far, the question that I wanted to know was, what were the resources that these individuals were having to reacclimate into society. And I found that there were resources in place. And so the reporting that I did just laid, again, some of this out. And I think there's more structures to put in place to have some of that information more publicly accessible. Again, from my perspective, to the benefit of those individuals who are returning to society, and also for the larger society, because it benefits it's very expensive to incarcerate individuals, and so both in terms of dollars and in terms of the human cost too.
Absolutely. Tara, earlier it looked like you had a question. Did you want to
Yeah.
share?
Yes, we all know that journalism can be a dangerous job, especially in the avenue of investigative journalism. How did you keep yourself safe, depending on the situation? Like, what's your advice as for journalists to keep themselves safe in certain situations?
That's a very good question, um, and one that I don't want to just respond to too quickly because it does require thought. Um, I would say um, one, I always identify myself with my press pass, and I have it. I could reach. I will reach. I have my press pass, and I always display that prominently whenever I'm going somewhere to report, and it does um, it does make you identifiable. Um, for some, that identification uh, is more positive, and others, um, but it's known, and it is something that, uh, as you have that press pass and you identify yourself as the press, um, you are trusting that there is uh, a protection in that. And so I would just go back to something I said earlier, which is the more that you can be transparent about who you are and what you're doing and what you're looking for, that's been helpful for me in my career. I'm not someone who thinks that it's good to be deceptive in trying to get a story or an article. I try to be as upfront as I can, um, because I think in doing that, you might not get the information the quickest way, but you'll get it in the most solid way, and it will also be a protection to yourself. And so that's what I'd say, and I hope maybe that answers your question. I don't know exactly um, the avenue that you were thinking of, but those are just some tips that I've found helpful.
Yeah. And I would think also, there's basic safety, like be aware of your surroundings, make sure you're not going places where no one knows you're going, those types of sort of basic living in the world type of things. But, I love that, Dwight, what you're saying is really, if you're open, honest, and upfront, at least people sort of understand why you're where you are and
Mm-hmm.
what you're trying to achieve, for better or for worse. And then sort of situational awareness is also important, because that
Yes.
way, have you ever had situations where you're like, I need to tap out, this is not a good situation to be in?
Well, to piggyback off of what you said, Rebecca, I think the basics still come into play. Look both ways before crossing the street, regardless of if you're at a rally or something. It's good to have that situational awareness and realize, yes, you are reporting. Yes, you are being the public's eyes and ears, but you also have to be your own eyes and ears and get where you're going. Um, as far as situations that are unsafe, I've had different places in my career where I've really had to consider that. But again, the role of the press, it does, to some extent, when there is press in the room or press at an event, I would say that it I don't know. There's historical examples that where it's gone the other way, but from my experience, it's a calming factor in some extent to some extent, and it's also something that increases safety because people are aware that what they're saying and their actions, may be being recorded.
Mhm. Yeah, so the traditional watchdog function, just making you don't want your mom to see, you not acting right at a rally. And it could very well happen, especially reporting for hometown papers. It's definitely, you're knitted more into the community. Um, I wanted to bring it back to the article for just a second. And from your perspective, this was an article that won out over a lot of different pieces. For you, what made it stand out? What for you, why is this the best of show article? No pressure for anything.
Well, my tongue-in-cheek answer, and I'll go ahead and say it, is I think you should ask the judges that because I was I was I was quite grateful, but I know that my colleagues in the state, and I know the tremendous amount of journalism that's done, and so just to be thought of in that way is humbling. Um, as for this one, um, again, the judges would really know the answer, but I do think maybe just because of the topic, um, because it is something that you could talk to little brother or little sister or little cousin, and this would matter to them.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that perhaps the topic and how far-reaching it is. This isn't something where you have to explain a government acronym to get to some bit of information that is important, but there are only 7 people in the general public who would know what it is. This is something that has a broad reach, and so perhaps that's why it was selected. But again, just uh, humbled to receive the recognition from those who chose it.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you're working on a lot of other really interesting pieces that I'm sure we'll see your name again, hopefully in the best of show and certainly in the contest.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, as we kind of wind down, I just wanted to ask you if you have, since we do our master class, of course, we record it as part of our podcast, but it also focuses on our early in career journalists. So as you, as a closing question, love to get your thoughts on what advice you would give to early in career journalists who want to go into investigative journalism or who want to make journalism their craft and their trade.
Hmm. Um, well, I'll give one bit of information that I would just say to journalists generally is there is a path for you. It's going to be different for each person, but it's needed work, and it's important work, and it's also, I would say, fulfilling work. And so everybody's path is going to be a little bit different, but there is a way that you can do this and help different publications and further your career. As far as the investigative piece, um, I would say follow your interests. Follow if you're really if you think something is not right, then do a little bit of digging and see what you can find. And again, you might not get it all with one article, but the steady build of your search and your asking questions. Sometimes it's not even the article. sometimes it's not what you actually get on paper, but sometimes it is that process of asking questions of various people. Um, and sometimes they'll respond and maybe they won't, but you asked the question and you made them hopefully think. And that's what you want your readers to do too, is to read what you write and think about it. And so I would just say, as far as investigative reporting and advice for that, to ask the questions and to follow what your sense of things is in terms of, if something's not right, then pursue it.
Chip away at it. I feel like you have sort of all these sort of questions and nuggets of information sort of scattered around that kind of can come into play. It feels like as an investigative journalist, you're really kind of playing the long game in some ways. Is that a misunderstanding?
No, and I think maybe that's part of who I am too. But you do have to. In that article that I mentioned with regards to the state prisons and reentry, that was the result of a Public Information Act request that took over a period of 6 months to be replied to. It involved a appeal to the Public Information Act Compliance Board.
Mm-hmm.
It involved a victory at that body, and then it involved pursuing that back to the original department where I requested the information, all to just get this much information.
Right.
Now, that much information isn't going to be the article, but again, just that process took months, and then you're able to, think about other things, do other things in the meantime. But then you can turn that into an article that, again, it's not legislation yet, but again, it was passed unanimously in one chamber. And again, one thing I don't do as a journalist is make predictions. That's not my business. But it did pass the one chamber and is going to be considered again next year based off of the reporting that I've done so far.
That's wonderful. Tara, I noticed you had a question earlier. What?
Yes. How important do you think it is to have a mentor in our field? And what has been some of the advice that you were given from a mentor that stuck with you to this day?
Thank you, Tara. I really appreciate that question. Any field that you're in, it's important to have a mentor, I would say. But journalism, it has been so crucial for me. I can think of someone who's started with me when my career was just starting and that I was learning from then. And to this day, whenever I'm in a thing where I don't know exactly where the next place is to go, I know I have that person, and that's been so valuable. As far as advice from that mentor, I can think of many things, but that individual advised me to have your journalistic standard so high that it just wouldn't be able to be questioned in terms of your process, in terms of, asking the right questions. And I don't know if I live up to that all the time, but, just that bit at the beginning of my career to fact check, to go back and, confirm things for yourself, based off of your reporting. That advice from the mentor, I'd like to think, is still with me today. And again, every day you got to try to make that the reality for the work that you're doing.
Mm. No, that's super powerful, because I do feel like, just like you said, journalism is a team effort, and nurturing young journalists, helping people grow in their skills and their craft, that is part of a team. And you need mentors, you need mentors who you aspire to be like. You need people alongside you to help you in that journey. And you also need people behind you to help bring
Mhm.
along
Mhm.
to keep it going. So
Mhm.
I really appreciate the time that you spent with us today
Well,
and sharing sort of the inner workings of how you created your investigative piece. And thanks to Natalie and Tiara for joining us as well. This has been terrific.
yes, and thank you all, and especially thanks to the fellow journalists who took their time this morning, and I'll be looking for your bylines as well.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks so much.
All right.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.